chapter 11, verses 1 through 12. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sands on the seashore. The word of the Lord. In the book called The Edge of Adventure, authors Keith Miller and Bruce Larson write about a letter that was found in a baking powder can that was wired to the handle of an old pump that offered the only hope of drinking water on a very long and seldom used trail across Nevada's Amargosa Desert. The letter read as follows. This pump is all right as of June 1932. I put a new sucker washer into it, and it ought to last 5 years. But the washer dries out, and the pump has got to be primed. Under the white rock, I buried a bottle of water out of the sun and cork end up. There's enough water in it to prime the pump, but not if you drink some first. Pour about 1/4 and let her soak to wet the leather. Then pour the rest in medium fast and pump like crazy. You'll get water. It's worth noting that get is spelled G-I-T. The well has never run dry. Have faith. When you get watered up, fill the bottle and put it back like you found it for the next feller. And it was signed Desert Pete, with the P.S., don't go drinking the water first, prime the pump with it, and you'll get all you can hold. That is one of my favorite stories about faith, especially about living in faith. Old Desert Pete had faith that the well would never run dry, and he made sure to pass that faith along to other thirsty travelers. Desert Pete didn't make it onto the list of heroes of the faith that we just read from Hebrews 11, but if we made a list of modern heroes of the faith, he'd have a pretty good shot of getting on it, at least as far as I'm concerned. We've talked before about faith, actually many times, because faith is at the core of our beliefs, and Hebrews 11 is really the Faith Hall of Fame. Now, I've been doing considerable reading lately about how there's a lot of religious leaders who believe that America is approaching a new religious awakening. They're calling it the Age of Faith. And this isn't new, of course, this labeling of different religious ages. In fact, it's very common and it's very cyclical. The Middle Ages is referred to as an age of faith. During that period of time, intense religious belief reigned among the people. And the Reformation has been called the Age of Revelation, where religious people renewed their emphasis on the revealed word in Scripture. And the 17th century began what was called the Age of Reason, with people like Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and others arguing for the power of the mind in critiquing religion. And the 20th century was called the Age of Experience, as various charismatic faiths exploded and modern Americans began to want to truly experience religion on many levels and in many ways. And now in the 21st century, we're coming back around to an age of faith where intense belief is reigning again. And I got to tell you, this makes sense to me. We, as a people, have spent the past 7 centuries exploring religion in different ways, and we've come all the way back around to faith. There are very few aspects of our Christian belief that are more critical than faith. Everything we do and think and believe and follow all come back to faith, to our faith in Jesus, to our faith in God. Because it's by God's grace, through faith, that we receive the gift of salvation. Faith in God is what keeps us going in the face of any and all challenges that life throws our way. Now, the Greek word for faith is pistis. It's fun to say, right? Pistis. If you're up on your Greek mythology, you'll know that pistis was one of the spirits who escaped Pandora's box and split back to heaven, leaving humanity to fend for itself, without hope, without pistis. In Luke 18, verse 8, when Jesus wonders aloud, "Will the Son of Man find faith on earth?" he was speaking to a Greek culture that believed the spirit of pistis had already left. Now, as always, when we're studying Scripture, we need to take a step back for a moment here and look at the context of what we're reading. The author of Hebrews is unknown. All we really know about its authorship is that it was likely written around the later part of 60 AD. And during that time, the church in Rome was having a huge problem with Christians being persecuted. So Hebrews was most likely written to Jewish Christians in Rome, or maybe Palestine, who were so discouraged that they were ready to just give up their Christian faith and go back to their Jewish beliefs because of this persecution. So the book of Hebrews was written to teach Jewish Christians about Jesus, that Jesus is from God and is higher than the angels, higher than Moses, higher than any priest. The writer of Hebrews states that after Jesus' death, the animal sacrifices in the Old Testament were no longer needed because Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice for all sins by dying himself. And Hebrews chapter 11 was written as the ultimate rah-rah passage for those early believers who were struggling in the face of this persecution. This list of ancient believers and the odds that they faced in their determination to do God's will would have empowered those early Christians and kept them focused on what mattered most, their faith in God. So the writer of Hebrews jumps right in there to define faith, or pistis, not as a mythological spirit that had abandoned humanity, but as a very real, very present aspect of our lives as children of God. Hebrews famously defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And while that's a wonderful definition of faith, I would also add that it's a great definition of hope as well, because hope and faith are tightly linked. I would venture to guess that all of us listening here this morning have hoped for something, yearned for something, and in faith asked God for these things. Sometimes our prayers are answered. Children are born, we get the job, the medical treatment works. Sometimes things take longer, like the audience of the book of Hebrews who were still waiting for Jesus' return. Sometimes we find ourselves waiting for an answer from God, and sometimes the answer isn't what we hoped it would be. And it's at that point that our faith has to shift into overdrive if we're gonna make it through. When my dad, Larry, was first diagnosed with cancer, we of course prayed for him to be healed. I spent hours praying hard for his healing. I knew God could heal him, so I prayed that God would heal him. I wrapped my prayers in every ounce of faith that I could, and I sent them heavenward, knowing that God would hear my prayers. And with that faith was the hope that Dad's cancer would go into remission and we would have more years with him. Less than a year after he was diagnosed, Dad died at home on my parents' farm not far from here. He was in a hospital bed by the window, next to the bed he'd shared with my mom for 36 years. It was a Sunday morning in August, and the bedroom window was open to let the early morning breeze in while it was still a bit cool. And Dad was lying on his back, his face turned toward the window, and one moment he was breathing, and the next moment he was gone. That night, after the hubbub of the coroner's visit and the hospice nurse coming by and various family members stopping in to distribute hugs and condolences, I went out into the backyard of the farmhouse. The summer air hung heavy around me, the night sky overhead blazing with stars while fireflies answered with lights of their own. And I sat down in the grass and I looked up at the stars and I asked God why my prayers for Dad's healing seemed to have fallen on deaf ears, why my faith had been rewarded with heartbreak. And in the silence and the darkness, I felt the answer. My prayers for Dad's healing had been answered. Dad had been healed, just not in the way I wanted. Dad was now cancer-free and whole. I just couldn't see it with my human eyes. And my faith was rewarded with the knowledge that one day I will see all that for myself when I join Dad in heaven. It can be difficult to follow God when we're not sure where God is leading. It can be scary. The unknown usually is. When we don't see evidence of action, we can start to wonder if God really is watching over us. But our faith never lets us abandon all hope, because faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. Faith matters. Our faith gives assurance that God has our best interest at heart, knows what we hope for, and holds our future. We can hope, but in faith, we often have to trust God with our future and find our assurance outside of ourselves. We have to have faith that, as the author of Hebrews writes, God has prepared a better place, a heavenly place for us, just as God prepared for Abraham. And all of this, of course, is about us living in faith. It's about us living out our faith. Every person mentioned in this passage from Hebrews, and we only read part of it here this morning, every person mentioned played a part in God's plan for salvation. Each person mentioned here lived a life of faith and of faithful obedience to God. They did as God asked of them without question. Each of these Jewish heroes and sheroes, yeah, I went there, built a foundation of faith that we are still adding to today. But they're more than just heroes of the faith. They're role models for all of us. They're examples to us of what we need to do and what we're called to do to help bring others to God. We shouldn't just read this passage the way I always did, as in get to the end and go, that's great, good for them. We should read this passage like an instruction manual. We should read this passage and realize that what they did is now up to us to do. Let me put it another way. And if you don't remember anything else I say here this morning, please let this stick. We, all of us, are part of God's plan for salvation. All of the people that we read about in Hebrews 11 were part of that plan. They lived in faith and they acted in faith and they paved the way right up to Jesus. Faith is an intense form of trust, and people's relationship with God has always operated on the basis of faith. Time and time again, all throughout the Bible, salvation is found in the same way: trusting God's promises by faith and then following God's commands. Faith is probably the most important part of anybody's spiritual life because, as the writer of Hebrews points out, it's confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we don't see. We can't see God. We can't even see Jesus anymore as people on earth once did. But we have assurance that they're very real and very much a part of our lives. And because we have that assurance about God, we can have confidence in what we hope for, life eternal in glory with God when our earthly lives are finished. So that's faith in a nutshell. But there's another element to faith that we need to recognize, and that's faith in action. James tells us that faith without works is dead, and that's what we see going on in Hebrews 11. These people didn't just have faith, they lived their faith. Every single person mentioned in this passage from Hebrews acted on their faith in one way or another, and it led us right here to where we are today. These people lived their lives by faith in God. In faith, Abel brought an expensive sacrifice to God. It wasn't the value of the sacrifice that mattered to God. It was the fact that Abel had so much faith in God and in God's goodness that he brought an expensive sacrifice, trusting that God would provide. Enoch lived in a way that pleased God, so much that God didn't make Enoch endure death. Noah obeyed divine warnings and built a giant ark, having never seen so much as a single drop of rain, and his family was spared. Abraham left his hometown and went out not knowing where God was leading. Sarah bore Isaac in her old age. Rahab risked everything when she hid the Israelite spies on her rooftop. The stories go on and on. The writer of Hebrews makes the point that many Old Testament people of faith trusted God for power and for victory, and they refused to compromise their faith in God, even when their circumstances were life-threatening. Yes, some of these faithful people died without having realized what God had promised. They didn't receive what God had promised before they died, so they had to find consolation in the fact that they would not realize the full blessings of God until they entered heaven. Other people powerfully experienced God's strength and deliverance, and their testimony of deliverance still stands. But many others, despite their implicit trust in God, experienced torture, mockings, beatings, imprisonment, stoning, destitution, affliction. These are the people, the scriptures tell us, of whom the world was not worthy. And if you follow the lineage of these people through the Old Testament, they all lead straight to Jesus. Jesus is the pivotal point in all of this. Our ancient sisters and brothers mentioned here were faithful to God and dedicated to living their lives in a way that showed their faith to the outside world. They built on each other's examples. And with the birth and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus, we see what was the dawn of a new age of living in faith. From the problems he encountered every day from the Jewish teachers of the law, to people who refused to believe in him, from betrayal by his own followers to anguished prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of his arrest, from his trial to his death on the cross, Jesus took every step and every breath of his earthly life in faith and in faithfulness to God. And now, well, I've said it roughly 10,000 times up here already, and I'm going to say it again this morning. We are the disciples now. We are the faithful now. We're the grandchildren of the heroes of the faith spelled out in Hebrews 11, and now it's our turn to step out in faith and to live our faith so visibly that those who don't yet believe will want to know more. Like the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, we are also an important part of God's plan for the salvation of people. We have to live our faith out loud and visibly so that through us, others may draw closer to God. If there was to be an updated version of Hebrews 11 written years from now, would our names be in it? Because of the example of these faithful ones, we should be motivated to throw off every weight that threatens to slow us down as we do what God asks of us. And when we do, we'll be much better able to run with perseverance the race marked out for us, looking to Jesus as our ultimate example of determination and faithfulness. All of God's promises are kept in Jesus. Every promise that God made to these people in the Old Testament looked ahead to Jesus. By believing the promise, these people were made right with God. Every promise God makes to the people in the New Testament also look to Jesus, whose work enables the blessings of God to come to people. In every case, God's promises are kept in Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. My challenge to all of us this week, and in the days and the weeks and the months ahead, is that we find more ways to live our faith out loud and visibly, so that we can take our place in the long line of the faithful who came before us and made a difference in the world. May it be so. Amen.